Hi there, it's Paulie here with Mr. Snoots, my wonderful co-host. So, today has been the 80th birthday of Marsha P. Johnson. Hail Marsha. Marsha is remembered with enormous honour and love by the transgender community. Marsha was a pivotal figure in the early gay rights movement in the USA, and particularly in the transgender freedom movement in the USA. So let's have a look. Marsha was, she had her 80th birthday today. She is no longer with us. Marsha was born into a poor family. I think she was one of 6 siblings in a poor family. Her father was a very low-paid mechanic. She was fascinated by the female gender and dressed in female clothing from a very early age, from age 5 onwards, but was often bullied and brutalized for doing so. In her very young childhood days, she was actually raped by a 13-year-old boy, and she was sexually attracted to men, but her mother, very religious person, declared homosexual to be lower than a dog, so she had to keep all that very, very secret, although eventually her mother realized that Marsha was essentially going to be gay and just advised him to go find a billionaire boyfriend to look after him. Marsha escaped off to New York City when she turned 17. Now, Marsha's gender identity. Marsha lived in a time when we were less precise about gender identities because we were still learning. She variously described herself as a drag queen and as a transvestite, and in her way tried to help define different terms. She defined a drag artist, someone who, as exactly what it is, someone who dresses in female clothing for entertainment of others, and then they take it off. They are only dressed in drag essentially for a show. She said transvestites are generally men who sometimes dress in female clothes but then take it off, and for most of their lives are dressed in male clothing and presenting male. And she said transsexuals were people who spent their lives in female clothing presenting female. Pretty good definitions there. We have removed transsexual and moved on to transgender and so forth. But as such, she described herself as a transsexual. She was on hormone treatments and she was trying to work towards gender affirming surgeries. However, was also quite famous for the occasional androgyny and the both the male and female aspects of presentation at times. Anyway, Marsha ended up in the Greenwich Village area of New York, which at that time was a kind of a low rent district where a lot of the counterculture people lived. It was also the home to things like there was the Village Voice newspaper, which sort of became influential. It was a sort of place where people like Andy Warhol and so on would, have studios and these sorts of things until they went uptown. But this was also an area where the gay clubs and so on existed. Marsha began just having to do survival sex work. Survival sex work is essentially when someone is forced into doing sex work because they have no alternatives. And at that time then, and indeed now amongst many transgender youth, often it is the only option because people have been ostracized by their families. They cannot get any work because they are transgender, so sex work becomes the only thing they can do for bare survival. So that's what Marsha was forced into doing, and as such couldn't afford really to live anywhere. There was a little park in the area, I think Christopher Street Park, I think it is. Many people, particularly young trans people, would just have to sleep in the park. But of course, New York's a place where it actually, snows and gets cold, so this is bad. Marsha would often sleep under the tables at the flower markets, and couldn't afford much in the way of an ensemble, couldn't afford fancy female clothes. So she became quite famous for wandering around in bright plastic high heels, robes and so on that she had made from whatever offcuts and florals that she could find, and would make fresh flower crowns from flowers that she had gleaned at the flower markets where she was staying. And this was her look. You will very often see photographs of her wearing these flower crowns. So she did manage to escape out of the sex work as her prime income, and became a performer in drag cabarets in the area, and began working for quite a few of them, and developed a reputation as a good performer. She was much sought after. She had high drag presentations then that she could do. She could afford, glamorous wigs and makeup and dresses and so on for those. But in her normal street life, sometimes she would just dress down in jeans and plaid shirts and a cap. Other times she would wear like see-through shirts and so forth. Other times she was still wandering around in her robes and her flower crowns. She became quite influential amongst the drag people there as someone that looked after disadvantaged kids, particularly, who had gotten caught having to do this survival sex work and so on, and looking after them. She was a big part of the community. She was taking on a role which has been very important in our community since it began, which was as a drag queen. To fill you in on that, transgender people have always been with us. And one of the ways they survived in places like the USA was in houses. These were, sometimes they were behind or over little junk cabarets where people performed drag acts and so forth. Other times it was cheap housing nearby. But there was always usually an older drag artist or trans woman who looked after young people, gave them a place to stay in a place that they paid the rent for. So you had a place to stay, and they made sure there was food there. They made sure they made sure there was heating. They looked after these kids. That's what Marsha was in this drag queen and house tradition. Very, very strong, particularly in the non-white trans community in the USA at the time. Also present to an extent in the white community, often in a more middle class function. But the houses and drag queens, very important part of drag culture at the time, a very respected part of drag culture at the time. But she was not yet really able to support others more in a moral sense. They were very often living in the park still. So we accelerate forward to the Stonewall Inn. Now, I've done a video on the Stonewall riots. Homemade ginger beer, there's nothing like it. That's why I keep staring at it. If you get to the ginger dregs in the bottom and just drink them, it's like fire, pain. But I loves it precious. Anyhow, in New York at that time, there were underground gay clubs. It was the 60s USA was then, and indeed still remains, an intensely corrupt and vicious environment. The police indeed were a criminal gang all to themselves, and indeed seem to remain so. But organised crime often bought cheap properties, turned them into gay clubs and cabarets, paid off local police to turn a blind eye to them, Every now and then police would conduct a raid, but someone that's on the payola would phone into the bar to let them know that they were coming. Often it was sort of scheduled. Tuesday nights, 10 o'clock, I believe, was the time when the Stonewall Inn used to be regularly raided once a month. So I would just clear the damn bar out, police would turn up, and then they'd come back in once the police had left. So this is not a good environment. Organised crime's involved, corrupt police are involved, brutal police are involved. Police love nothing more than brutalising helpless gay and trans people. So the Stonewall was one of these. It was mafia owned, actually. And it was a higher end club for rich gay men. It had about a 98% gay male clientele. The back room, however, was for those who were female presenting. There was a room back there because it was also a place where a lot of the, what would you call them now? Log cabin gays, is that the term you guys use? We just call them class traders. But yes, the gays that were trying to be more respectable, so they didn't have to see this. But there were also lesbian couples who were out in the back room, and transgender people have always had a close reliance with the lesbian community and have always cared for the lesbian community. When the police decided, bafflingly, to raid outside of alert hours, they just organised a raid on the place one night in 1969. They decided to start feeling up butch lesbians, and were sexually assaulting butch lesbians. The transgender women in the club immediately turned on the police and started a violent confrontation, and this spread out into the streets. There are many different people who have been claimed by different sources to have sort of somehow sparked off the riot. Those of you who've been in riots and demonstrations know that there's no such thing as the person that sparked it off. These tend to have much broader causes and a lot of people. However, Marsha P. Johnson was obviously extremely notable for her role. These riots lasted over multiple days. But on that first night, Marsha was not in the bar. Marsha was, however, nearby. The police were used to just basically brutalising people, seizing people, shoving them in vans and getting them off down to the police station. But they had stopped to indulge themselves in some violence and sexual assault that night. And that was their fatal error, because the transgender people fought back, and the lesbians fought back, and then the gays fought back. And glass was shattered, the main windows were shattered, and this brought this into the street, where hustlers, which are essentially street prostitutes and just people at other cabarets, came thundering in to start tearing people out of the hands of the police, who were trying to pack them into vans to pull them out. Marsha Johnson saw that this was happening and ran into that Christopher Street park where many young trans sex workers were trying to sleep for the night. Marsha had a particular friend, Sylvia Rivera, who was in the park at the time. These two were very tight, very tight. In fact, they had actually made a pact with each other as best of friends to cross the River Jordan together. If one dies, both die. They're not going alone. Bless you, Marsha. But she came running up to her friend and said, huge stuff going on at the Stonewall. So they got everyone in the park and went thundering down to add to the crowd. And it was on for young and old. The police were beaten back. It was amazing. The drag artists and performers from local clubs came streaming out. They held police back by making kick lines. I kid you not. showgirl kick lines, arms linked, and just high kicks to keep the police at bay. The police, of course, decided to escalate, and the entire region turned against them. This continued going through the wee hours of the night. This all began at 2 or 3 in the morning and continued going. The next day, the police decided to come thundering in to clean that area up, and Greenwich Village turned against them. But gays and transgender people from the community had come flooding in to help hold their territory. Whose streets? Our streets, remember. And this is where Marsha P. Johnson began to shine. There was a building site over the road from the Stonewall. Marsha very famously filled a bag full of bricks, and when the cops decided to park a police car nearby, she scaled a lamppost and hurled this through the windscreen and smashed it in, and seems to have, because assaulting a police officer is a bad thing, Marsha, of course, was foxy about confirming claims that she hurled a lot of bricks at a lot of police. However, it is a huge part of transgender folklore, and the past wisdom, the verbal wisdom passed on by those who were there, is that, yeah, she and others were hurling bricks. That is why on days of transgender visibility and remembrance, you will see brick memes running around, often painted in these transgender colours. One, it's a memory that no rights are given to you. They will only be won through fighting, which I would like my brothers and sisters in the USA and the UK to remember fiercely right now. But anyway, the riots went on and on and on. They set fire to police cars, they rolled them over. The Village Voice had made scurrilous headlines about how, fags and trannies, pardon the expressions, were, these revolting people were destroying the streets. So that office got torched as well. High time too. But in the wake of all this, Johnson and her friend Rivera had become true leaders of this, essentially a revolutionary gay and trans community. This was the moment where they stood up and said, we want our rights. We have rights. We are willing to fight for these rights. That's when it happened. That's why they're remembered with such love and reverence. They immediately became very politically active. The gay liberation organisations that started right then were far more revolutionary than some very, what would you call it, pick-me gay groups that had been spreading from California. This was revolutionary action. We demand gay rights. They made Greenwich Village gay AF, and there was no stopping them. They immediately managed to start working very positively towards those rights. They began meeting with mayoral delegations and with the mayor and insisting on their rights. The first Pride Parade the next year in 1970, they were main organisers of. However, the pick-me gays had began thundering in and were trying to basically get rid of what they considered the people who were freaks and make middle-class white gay people look bad. So very early on, Johnson and her friend Rivera started a group called STAR. STAR stood for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, double checks. That was it, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. Way more militant and way more revolutionary, and very much going for the transgender rights that were already trying to be cut out from the entire story by the very people whose rights that they were helping to establish. Star focused very much on the welfare of young trans kids, and this is where they managed to get together and get enough money to organise a house that Johnson in particular became the drag mother of. Johnson and Rivera paid the rent by doing more sex work, essentially. That was how they paid for this. But it was all donated entirely to looking after the baby trans and getting them safe places to stay and out of trans work. Marsha became a very beloved activist. Marsha, the P, by the way, officially in later years she said it was Piola, but generally she said the P stood for Pay It No Mind, which is the answer when everyone asked her what her sex was. And in fact, that answer got her out from in front of a judge at one point when she was, picked up fastling. So she was definitely a character. So, very much activated by Stonewall and energised, Marsha became quite a sought-after performer. She performed in a number of quite big shows, and she was photographed by Andy Warhol and used as a model by Andy Warhol, who did a series of photograph. I think it was called the He and She exhibition, but she was one of his chosen models for all this. So, in her way, she was in demand. However, 1973, as these gay pride parades are taking off and they're spreading from city to city to city, and the New York one is getting bigger, the pick-me gays announced that they weren't going to allow transgender women into Pride Parade because it made them look bad. Johnson and Rivera gathered transgender women, and also supported by many from the lesbian community, which included transgender men, and they said, screw you, and they proudly paraded ahead of the main parade, stealing pride of place from these complete assholes. So definitely one who rolled her sleeves up and came out with both fists flying. And in fact, it's kind of renowned for that. Marsha was described by many as having a very saintly personality, very kind, weirdly spiritual. Rivera said she would find her in strange churches, could be Greek Orthodox, could be Russian Orthodox, could be Catholic, just going in and saying prayers, but also would be lighting candles at Buddhist shrines or outside of Hindu or Hindu temples, or whatever. She clearly believed in sort of a personal relationship with the divine. She has, however, also been described as having something of a bipolar personality, and being able to fly into a violent rage when provoked. Given where she was living and what she was dealing with, I can absolutely see that. Marsha became an advocate for the AIDS community. Marsha was taken into someone's house when the temperature really dropped in New York one year, and it was a gay couple's house, and she stayed with them as the AIDS epidemic began. When one of the partners became ill, Marsha became his primary carer, and then she began to see one of her main roles in life as caring for the sick and for the dying and staying with them. So she became the AIDS angel. She became the one that looked after so many people, just holding the hands of dying people. She did end up with AIDS herself, sex work in that period, but became an advocate for the rights of people with AIDS. She was very much in love with life and with living. And here's where she comes to a squirrely end. In 1992, Marsha P. Johnson was found floating in the Hudson River with the back of her head bashed in. Police ruled this as suicide. We're drinking on that one. At that time, there had been a huge rise in gay bashings, in violence against gay and particularly, of course, transgender individuals. 20% or more of these were being inflicted by the police. Marsha P. Johnson was one of the major advocates bringing this to public attention. She was getting it to the newspaper, she was getting it to the radio, she was getting it to anyone that could possibly need to know and help, and was a massive thorn in the police's side. And then the day after doing some major activism on this, she ended up mysteriously dead. And the police, of course, just said, dead black transgender woman, who gives a shit, and decided not to investigate, even though people had heard a known violent offender brag about killing her. For decades this has been left. However, about 20 years ago, there was finally pressure put on this to at least declare it to be a murder case and remove the suicide tag. However, it remains uninvestigated and unsolved. She left behind her a legacy of activism, of solidarity within the transgender community. She helped establish rights that the gay and trans communities had never had before. She was a pivotal person. She came from nowhere, not a cent to her name. And she took what little she could get and combined it with a huge spirit and a huge love for her community and moved mountains. She is an inspiration. To this day, her face remains the poster face for transgender rights and for militant action to protect and defend transgender rights. When you see pictures of this tall black woman with flower crowns, that's Marsha. When you see those memes of bricks, that's Marsha too. But possibly forgotten in her story is the quiet spirituality of the woman, of the way she helped in media to define the differences between drag and transvestite and transsexual communities. But also, I think what's forgotten are those fantastic actions as the drag mother of a house looking after disadvantaged transgender youth, and of that absolute angel being there for the sick and dying at the height of the AIDS epidemic. History is made entirely by human actors, those whose actions shape events. As such, this poor black woman is a major historical actor and deserves to be remembered with much respect and honour. Thank you, Marsha, and we remember. Anyway, cheers everybody. Much love to you all.